image is burned into my mind, an elderly woman, frail and fading, lying motionless in the biting Colorado snow. She was wearing an oversized military jacket, a heavy piece of olive drab canvas that once belonged to her fallen son. But she wasn't alone for long.
Out of the white mist emerged a man who knew that jacket all too well. A former Navy SEAL, led by the unwavering nose of Shadow, his loyal K-9 partner. My name is Wilder. I've spent 55 years in the wild, and I've learned that the universe has a strange way of weaving our scars together. This isn't just a rescue. It's a meeting of two broken souls, brought together by a dog who refused to let a hero's mother freeze in the dark. Before we dive into this miracle at Silverthorne, I have to ask, where are you listening to this story from? Tell me your location in the comments. And if you believe that every life is connected by an invisible thread, subscribe to join our pack.
The winter in Silverthorne, Colorado, doesn't just arrive. It conquers. It's a place where the jagged peaks of the Rockies bite into a sky so blue it feels sharp, and the air smells of frozen pine and the kind of absolute silence that can make a man hear his own heartbeat.
Down in the valley, the town looks like a scattering of toy houses, but up here, on the high ridges, the world is a relentless kingdom of white and gray. Deep within this frozen wilderness sits a cabin, its timber dark and weathered by decades of storms. On the porch, leaning against a railing encrusted with frost, stands Caleb Vance. At 38, Caleb carries the build of a man who was forged in the harshest fires of the military. He is 6'2", with shoulders that seem to bear the weight of the mountain itself. His body is a map of scars, some visible, like the jagged line across his left temple, and others buried deep beneath his weathered skin. His face is rugged, with a jawline as sharp as a cliffside, softened only by a thick, dark beard peppered with premature gray. His eyes, once a vibrant hazel, are now the color of cold tea, reflecting a distant, hollow stillness. Caleb was a Navy SEAL, a man trained to survive anything, except for the guilt of being the only one who came home from a mission that turned into a massacre in the deserts of the Middle East. He doesn't talk much. He moved to Silverthorne because he wanted to be where the wind was the only thing that asked him questions. Beside him, sitting as still as a statue, is Shadow. Shadow is a 5-year-old German shepherd, a retired K-9 with a coat the color of a stormy night, deep blacks blending into rich tans around his paws and chest. He is a magnificent creature, 75 pounds of pure muscle and instinct. One of his ears has a small notch from a shrapnel fragment, a permanent reminder of the day he saved Caleb's life during that final, disastrous operation. Shadow doesn't wag his tail for treats or bark at squirrels. He moves with a predatory grace and an intelligence in his dark, amber eyes that feels almost human. He is the guardian of Caleb's sanity, the only living soul who knows the sound of Caleb's night terrors. Caleb reaches down, his gloved hand resting on Shadow's head. "Time to move," he mutters. His voice is a low rasp, unused to long conversations. They begin their daily patrol. To an outsider, it might look like a hike, but to Caleb, it's a mission. He maintains a strict military pace, his boots crunching rhythmically through the fresh powder. This is how he survives the day, by treating the mountain like a battlefield. He scans the ridgeline for movement, checks the perimeter of his property, and keeps his mind locked on the physical effort to avoid the memories waiting in the shadows of his mind. But the memories are stubborn. Every time the wind howls through the pines, Caleb hears the echoes of radio chatter. Every time a branch snaps under the weight of snow, he feels the jolt of an IED. They pass the old mailbox at the edge of the trail, a rusted metal box that stands like a lonely sentinel. Inside, Caleb knows there are letters. These letters come from the Miller family, the Vance family, and the mothers of the 4 other men who didn't make it off that dusty hillside. Sarah Miller, Daniel's mother, writes the most. Caleb has never met her, but he imagines her as a woman of quiet strength, perhaps with the same stubborn kindness Daniel had. He pictures her sitting at a kitchen table in some warm house, waiting for a reply that never comes. Caleb cannot bring himself to open them. He cannot bear to see the words "thank you" or "tell us about his last moments." To him, those letters are tactical explosives. If he opens one, his entire carefully constructed world of silence will blow apart. He leaves them there, letting the snow bury the envelopes, just as he tries to bury his own heart. As they climb higher, the sky begins to bruise into a deep, threatening purple. A storm is rolling in, faster than the forecast predicted. The wind picks up, whipping fine crystals of ice into Caleb's face, stinging like needles. Shadow suddenly stops. His body goes rigid, his ears shifting forward, catching a sound that is lost to human ears. A low, vibrating rumble starts in the dog's chest. Not a growl of aggression, but a signal of discovery. "What is it, boy?" Caleb asks, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. Shadow doesn't look back. He turns his head toward the north slope, a treacherous area filled with hidden crevices and steep drops. He whines once, a sharp, urgent sound that breaks the stillness. Caleb looks at the darkening sky. A seal knows when to retreat. The temperature is dropping, and the visibility is fading to zero. Everything in his training says to turn back to the cabin, to secure the perimeter, to stay safe. But Shadow takes a step toward the slope. Then another. He looks back at Caleb, his eyes glowing in the fading light, filled with a desperate, ancient pleading. Caleb feels a chill that has nothing to do with the wind. For the first time in years, he is faced with a choice: stay in the safety of his self-imposed prison, or follow the only friend he has left into the heart of the storm. Shadow barks, a singular booming command that echoes off the canyon walls. "Fine," Caleb whispers, the wind swallowing his words. "Lead the way." And as the first heavy flakes of the blizzard begin to fall, the soldier and his dog vanish into the white, chasing a ghost they haven't even met yet.
The sky above Silverthorne didn't just darken. It bruised, turning a heavy, suffocating shade of charcoal that signaled the true fury of a Colorado blizzard.
The wind began to howl, a high-pitched, mournful shriek that tore through the pine needles and whipped the fallen powder into blinding white cyclones. Caleb Vance felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the internal alarm of a soldier who knew that the environment had just become a predator. His vision was reduced to a few feet of swirling chaos, his eyelashes freezing together with every blink. Beside him, Shadow was no longer just a companion. He was a coiled spring of pure, ancestral instinct. The German shepherd's ears were pinned back against the wind, his powerful frame low to the ground as he fought the gusts that threatened to knock a man off his feet. Suddenly, Shadow let out a sharp, guttural huff, a sound that wasn't a bark, but a realization. Without a single glance back at Caleb, the K9 broke his disciplined heel and lunged into the white wall of the storm. Caleb shouted his name, the sound instantly swallowed by the roar of the gale. He had no choice but to trust the animal whose life had been intertwined with his own in the sands of a distant desert. Caleb lowered his goggles, gripped his trekking poles, and pushed into the void, following the ghost-like silhouette of a black and tan tail disappearing into the maw of the north slope. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as Caleb tracked the faint disturbances in the snow left by Shadow. The mountain was shifting, the terrain deceptive under the deepening drifts. Every step was a gamble against hidden crevices that could snap a femur like a dry twig. Finally, through a momentary lull in the wind, he heard it, a persistent rhythmic barking coming from a jagged limestone outcrop known as the Devil's Throat. Caleb scrambled over a frozen ridge, his lungs burning with the sub-zero air, until he saw Shadow. The dog was frantically digging at the entrance of a shallow rock alcove, his paws throwing up clumps of ice and frozen earth. Shadow wasn't hunting, he was guarding. As Caleb knelt beside him, his headlamp sliced through the gloom, revealing a sight that made his heart stop. Tucked into the hollow of the stone was a figure, half buried by the encroaching drifts. It was a woman, her face as pale as the marble of a tombstone, her eyes closed in the dangerous lethargy of stage 2 hypothermia. She looked small, far too small for the garment she was wearing. Wrapped around her shivering frame was a massive weathered M65 field jacket, the heavy olive drab fabric stained with age and salt, looking like a relic of a war fought decades ago. This was Martha Miller. At 60 years old, Martha carried a face that was a map of gentle wisdom and recent, shattering sorrow. Usually she was the heartbeat of the Silverthorne community, a retired history teacher known for her sharp wit and her habit of leaving baskets of sourdough on her neighbors' porches. She was a woman of average height, though grief had made her shoulders stoop, as if she were constantly leaning into a headwind. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut like her son's, was now a soft, unkempt silver, usually tied back with a simple ribbon, but now matted with frost. Martha was not a woman of the wilderness. She was a woman of books and quiet gardens, but today, she had been driven by a singular, desperate necessity. It was the first anniversary of her son Daniel's death, and she had climbed this treacherous slope to reach his favorite overlook, carrying a small silk pouch of his ashes. She had intended to give him back to the wind, but a slip on a patch of black ice had sent her tumbling into the crevice, her ankle snapping with a sickening pop that left her stranded as the sky fell in. Caleb reached out, his gloved fingers trembling as he checked the pulse at her neck. It was thready, a faint tapping against the cold. Shadow pressed his large, warm body against her side, instinctively trying to share his core heat with the fading woman. As Caleb adjusted his light, he noticed the jacket again, It was far too big for her, the sleeves rolled up in thick, clumsy bunches. On the left breast, just above the pocket, was a faded black and tan strip of webbing. Caleb leaned in, his breath hitching. The name Miller was stenciled there in block letters, worn but unmistakable. His mind flashed to a human night in a cramped barracks, Daniel Miller laughing as he stitched a loose button onto that very jacket, bragging about his mother's apple pie. The coincidence was a physical blow, a jagged piece of the past cutting through the present. Martha moaned, a soft, delirious sound that barely carried over the wind. She clutched the lapels of the jacket with a blue-tinged hand, her fingers locked in a death grip on the only piece of her son she had left. Caleb realized then that she hadn't come up here to survive. She had come up here to say goodbye, and the mountain had nearly decided to make that goodbye permanent. The storm showed no sign of relenting. Caleb knew he couldn't carry her out in this, not with the wind speeds peaking and the visibility near zero. He began to clear the snow from the alcove, using his survival shovel to build a small berm to block the wind. Shadow never moved from her side, his amber eyes fixed on Caleb with an intensity that demanded action. Caleb stripped off his own outer layer to wrap it around Martha's legs, his tactical training taking over, even as his mind reeled from the discovery of her identity. He looked at the woman who had written him those unopened letters, the woman whose son had died, so that Caleb could stand here today. Martha's breathing was shallow, a rhythmic rasping that echoed against the cold stone walls. In her pocket, tucked safely beneath the heavy canvas of the military jacket, was the silk pouch, still unopened. She had failed her mission, but Shadow had ensured she wouldn't fail her life. As the blizzard screamed outside their narrow stone sanctuary, Caleb sat in the dark, one hand on his dog's neck and the other on the shoulder of the mother he had been too afraid to face, waiting for a break in the wind that might never come.
The sanctuary of the stone alcove was a fragile illusion, a thin barrier of limestone that did little to muffle the demonic shrieking of the blizzard outside.
Caleb Vance knelt in the frozen dirt, his tactical watch glowing a ghostly neon green in the dark. Martha Miller's pulse was failing, the rhythmic thrumming under her skin becoming as erratic as a dying bird's wing. He looked at the woman, then at the wall of white death just inches away. In the high altitudes of Silverthorne, when the mercury drops this fast, the body stops fighting and starts to shut down, organ by organ. Shadow, sensing the shift in the air, let out a low, mournful whine that vibrated through Caleb's knees. The dog knew what Caleb was realizing. Martha was too fragile to be moved in this state without a stretcher, and Caleb couldn't carry her through the zero visibility drifts while ensuring they didn't both plummet off a hidden ledge. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on them, demanding a sacrifice. Shadow stepped forward, his cold, wet nose pressing against Martha's pale cheek. He began to lick her face with a frantic, rhythmic persistence. The rough texture of his tongue, a desperate attempt to stimulate her nerves and keep her from slipping into the final, painless sleep of the frozen. Martha's eyelids fluttered, a soft, broken whisper escaping her blue-tinged lips. She wasn't calling for help. She was murmuring the name of the boy whose jacket she wore. "Daniel, wait for me. Don't go into the light yet," she breathed, her voice so thin it was nearly transparent. Shadow paused, his amber eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that transcended his species. He had seen Daniel fall. He had felt the soul leave the body in the dust of a war zone. With a gentle movement, Shadow nudged his head under her limp hand, then did something that broke Caleb's heart. The dog reached up and tugged at the thick red wool bandana tied around his neck, a gift Caleb had given him years ago. With a sharp pull, the knot slipped. Shadow dropped the fabric, still warm from his own fur, onto Martha's exposed neck, tucking it in with his snout. It was a gesture of profound empathy, a K9's way of saying he would return. Shadow turned to Caleb, his gaze sharp and commanding, and before Caleb could utter a command, the dog vanished back into the screaming maw of the storm. Back at the cabin, the world was supposed to be safe, but for Caleb, safety was a relative term. He had retreated there an hour ago to gather more medical supplies, but the altitude and the stress had triggered one of his debilitating ghost headaches, a searing white-hot agony that felt like a hot wire being threaded through his brain, a souvenir from a concussive blast in his past. He was slumped against the heavy oak door of the cabin, his eyes squeezed shut, trying to breathe through the waves of nausea. The fire in the hearth was nothing more than glowing embers, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. A thunderous, frantic scratching erupted against the wood of the door, followed by a series of barks so loud and jagged they sounded like gunfire. Caleb groaned, clutching his temples. "Not now, Shadow. Stay in the mudroom," he muttered, his voice thick with pain. But the dog wouldn't stop. The scratching turned into a violent assault, the sound of claws splintering the heavy timber. Then came the howling, a long, primal sound of absolute urgency that bypassed Caleb's pain and struck directly at his amygdala. Caleb forced himself to his feet, the room spinning. He cracked the door open, and Shadow practically exploded into the room. The dog was a mess of ice and frozen blood from the crags, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't head for his water bowl. Instead, he lunged at Caleb, grabbing the sleeve of his heavy thermal shirt in his teeth, and jerking with a force that nearly sent Caleb back to the floor. "Shadow, stop! I'm hurting, boy!" Caleb rasped, but the dog's eyes were different. They weren't the eyes of a pet. They were the eyes of a soldier on a battlefield who refused to leave a man behind. Shadow let out a sharp, piercing yelp and ran toward the gear rack, barking at the heavy-duty rescue sled and the medical trauma bag. He ran back to Caleb, nudging his hand upward, his tail hitting the furniture with an impatient thud. In that moment, the fog of the headache cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The seal was awake. Caleb looked at the dog, seeing the missing bandana, seeing the desperation in the animal's posture. He realized that Shadow hadn't come back for warmth. He had come back to recruit the only man who could finish the mission. The instinct of the warrior, dormant and buried under layers of self-pity, surged back to life. Caleb grabbed his tactical parka, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 deployments. He strapped on his crampons, grabbed the heavy sled, and checked his GPS. "I hear you, Shadow," he whispered, his voice steady for the first time in months. "We're going back for her." As they stepped back out into the heart of the blizzard, the pain in Caleb's head was gone, burned away by the singular, driving purpose of a race against time, where every second meant the difference between a funeral and a miracle. The world outside the cabin had dissolved into a chaotic white void, a place where the distinction between earth and sky was lost to the fury of the blizzard.
Caleb Vance pushed forward, his body hunched against the wind, his legs churning through snow that had already drifted hip-deep in the coulees. Each step was a battle of attrition. The cold was no longer just an environmental factor, but a physical enemy trying to leech the life from his muscles.
Shadow led the way like a dark, relentless engine of bone and fur. The German Shepherd didn't just walk, he carved a path, his powerful chest acting as a snowplow, his senses tuned to a frequency Caleb could barely perceive. Caleb leaned into the weight of the rescue sled trailing behind him, his breathing heavy and rhythmic, a sound that synchronized with the crunch of his crampons on the hidden ice beneath the powder. They were moving back toward the Devil's Throat, fighting for every inch of altitude. The wind screamed through the jagged rocks, sounding like the voices of the men Caleb had lost, but he didn't let the ghosts distract him this time. He had a mission, and for a Navy SEAL, a mission was a tether to reality. When they finally reached the limestone alcove, the sight was haunting. The snow had nearly walled Martha in, leaving only a small, dark gap where Shadow's red bandana fluttered weakly in the draft, a tiny splash of defiance against the monochrome world. Caleb dropped to his knees, his hands moving with the clinical precision of a field medic. Martha's skin was the color of wood ash, and her breathing had slowed to a terrifying cadence, long, hollow pauses followed by a sharp, ragged gasp. "Martha, stay with me," Caleb rasped, his voice cracking. He reached for his trauma kit, pulling out chemical heat packs and an emergency space blanket. To treat her effectively, he had to assess her core and check the severity of the leg fracture. He reached for the heavy, oversized military jacket she wore, his gloved fingers fumbling with the frozen buttons. As he peeled back the stiff, olive-drab canvas to apply heat to her chest, his headlamp caught a glint of movement. He stopped. His heart, already racing from the climb, seemed to seize in his chest. There, stitched into the fabric just above the heart, was a strip of blackened webbing. The letters were faded from sun and sand, but they burned into Caleb's retinas like white phosphorus. D. Miller. Time fractured. The howling wind of Silverthorne was replaced by the staccato rhythm of heavy machine gun fire and the metallic scent of burning oil. Caleb saw Daniel Miller again, not as a memory, but as a vivid, agonizing presence. He saw Danny standing in the dust of the god-forsaken valley, his young face split by a grin just seconds before the world turned into a fireball. Danny had lunged in front of Caleb, taking the brunt of a concussive blast that should have ended both of them. The jacket Caleb was holding now was the very one Danny had worn during their downtime in the barracks, the one he'd joked about his mother mending. The woman lying in the snow wasn't just a stranger. She was the mother of the man who had traded his life for Caleb's. The realization was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made Caleb's vision blur. He wasn't just rescuing a civilian, he was trying to pay back a debt that could never be settled. Shadow nudged Caleb's shoulder, a low, urgent whine bringing him back to the present. The mountain didn't care about his grief. It only cared about the clock. Suddenly, a dull, heavy thud vibrated through the limestone beneath them, followed by a terrifying sibilant hiss. A few hundred yards above their position, a massive cornice had failed. It wasn't a mountain-killing avalanche, but it was enough. A river of white debris tumbled down the slope, choking the narrow trail they had used to ascend and burying the path back to the cabin under 6 feet of unstable, packed ice. Caleb looked at the blockage, then at the steep, treacherous rock face to their left, the only other way down. The ledge was narrow, slippery, and dropped into a sheer abyss. He had a choice: stay in the alcove and wait for a rescue team that might not arrive until the storm cleared, or attempt to carry Martha across the cliffside. The safe choice was to stay. But looking at the gray tint of Martha's lips, Caleb knew she wouldn't survive another hour of stationary cold. "We're going over the edge, Shadow," Caleb said, his voice hardening into the command tone of a leader. He strapped Martha securely into the rescue sled, wrapping her in his own thermal layers until she was a bundle of olive drab and neon orange. The traverse was a nightmare of verticality and ice. Caleb hoisted the sled onto his back for the steepest sections, his fingers searching for handholds in the frozen cracks of the cliff. Martha was a dead weight, her head lolling against his shoulder, her whispers of Daniel haunting his ear. Below them, the valley was a black pit of shadows. One slip meant a 300-foot fall into the pines. Shadow moved ahead, his claws scratching for purchase on the narrowest of ledges. The dog seemed to possess a supernatural understanding of the mountain's architecture. He would pause on a seemingly solid rock, test it with a paw, and then bark once, a sharp, confident signal for Caleb to follow. At one point, a gust of wind threatened to peel Caleb off the wall, but Shadow lunged back, grabbing the strap of Caleb's pack in his teeth, anchoring him for the critical seconds it took for the gust to pass. It was a dance of 3 souls on the brink of extinction. When they finally reached the lower, stable ground beyond the slide zone, Caleb's muscles were screaming and his hands were bled raw through his gloves. But they were alive. He looked down at the woman in the jacket and then at the dog who had led them through the impossible. The ghosts were still there, but for the first time, they were silent, watching a soldier fight his way back to the living. The interior of the cabin was a stark contrast to the white purgatory they had just escaped. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin, dry wood, and the metallic tang of the medical kit.
Caleb Vance moved with a frantic yet controlled efficiency, his boots thudding against the floorboards as he carried Martha Miller to the heavy oak table near the hearth. He had already stoked the embers back into a roaring blaze, the orange light flickering against the walls like a heartbeat.
Shadow was a constant presence, his fur matted with ice that began to drip onto the rug, but he refused to shake it off. The K9 followed Caleb's every movement, his amber eyes never leaving Martha's face. Caleb worked quickly, stripping away the frozen layers of her clothing, careful to preserve the D. Miller jacket, which he draped over a chair near the fire. He applied warm compresses to her core and stabilized her shattered ankle with a makeshift splint, fashioned from cedar slats and surgical tape. His hands, though scarred and calloused, moved with a gentleness that surprised him, a remnant of the man he was before the world had turned to ash and dust. As the heat of the cabin began to leach the deadly chill from Martha's bones, her color shifted from a ghostly gray to a faint, bruised rose. Her breathing deepened, no longer the shallow rattle of a dying woman. Shadow paced over and curled his heavy, 75-pound frame directly beneath the edge of her cot, his chin resting on her boots. He was a living furnace, a silent sentinel who had claimed this woman as his own charge. Finally, Martha's eyes flickered open. They were clouded with confusion at first, reflecting the dancing flames, but then they cleared, settling on Caleb. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was filled only by the crackle of the fireplace and the rhythmic panting of the dog. Martha's gaze drifted down to Caleb's right forearm, where his thermal sleeve was pushed up to reveal a faded, intricate tattoo, an anchor wrapped in a trident, the fierce mark of the Navy SEALs. Her breath caught, a small, trembling sound. "I know that mark," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves scuttling across stone. "Daniel, he sent me a photo once. He said the men who wore that were the only family he needed outside of me." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat, a pressure so immense it threatened to choke him. He looked at Martha, really looked at her, and saw the echoes of his best friend in the curve of her jaw and the stubborn light in her eyes. "I was with him, Martha," Caleb said, the words feeling like shards of glass. "I was there that day. I'm the one he saved." Martha didn't cry. Instead, she reached out a thin, trembling hand and rested it on Caleb's scarred knuckles. Her touch was surprisingly warm. "Then you were the reason my son died a hero, Caleb Vance," she said softly. "I knew it was you the moment I saw the dog. Daniel told me about Shadow too. He said the dog was the soul of the team." The weight of a year's worth of unspoken grief began to shift in the room. Caleb spent the next several hours doing something he hadn't done since the war. He talked. He told her about Daniel's laughter in the face of danger, how he used to sneak extra rations to the local village kids, and how he had stitched that very jacket while humming old songs. In return, Martha told him about the boy who used to collect smooth river stones, and the young man who wrote poetry in the margins of his tactical manuals. They were two people from different worlds, stitched together by a single life that had been cut short. As the night deepened and the blizzard continued to lash the cabin's exterior, Caleb walked over to the small, dust-covered side table where the pile of unopened mails sat. He looked at the stack, no longer seeing them as tactical threats, but as a bridge. With trembling fingers, he picked up the top envelope, the one with the neat, elegant handwriting he now recognized as Martha's. He opened it and began to read. He expected accusations. He expected the why that haunted his dreams. Instead, he found grace. "Dear Caleb," the letter read, "I don't need to know the details. I only want you to know that Daniel loved you like a brother. If you are alive, then a part of him is still walking this earth, and that is enough for me. Please, don't be a ghost." Caleb sank into the chair beside the fire, the letter shaking in his hand. He realized then that while he had been hiding in the mountains to protect himself from the world's judgment, the person with the most right to judge him had been the one trying to set him free. Shadow let out a soft, contented sigh, his tail thumping once against the floor, as if he sensed the change in the air. The K9 had led Caleb into the storm to rescue a stranger, but in doing so, he had forced Caleb to rescue himself. The letters weren't a burden anymore. They were a map back to the living. Caleb looked at Martha, who had drifted into a peaceful sleep, the red wool bandana still tucked around her neck. He picked up his pen and a scrap of paper, his hand steady for the first time in 365 days. He wasn't sure what he would write to the other families yet, but he knew how to start. Outside, the wind was still howling, but inside the cabin, the ghosts had finally laid down their arms. The connection was made, not just between a soldier and a mother, but between a man and his own soul, facilitated by the silent, amber-eyed guardian who slept at their feet.
The winter that had nearly claimed Martha Miller's life eventually surrendered to the persistent warmth of a Colorado spring. In Silverthorne, the transition was a symphony of melting ice and rushing water. As the Blue River swelled with the runoff from the high peaks,
the jagged white world turned into a tapestry of emerald pines and the first stubborn wildflowers pushing through the thawing soil. Martha's recovery had been a long, arduous process, marked by months of physical therapy and the slow mending of bone. But her spirit had healed far faster than her ankle. Instead of returning to the hollow silence of her house in the city, where every hallway echoed with the absence of her son, she made a decision that surprised no one who knew her heart. She bought a small sun-drenched cottage on the edge of Silverthorne, a place with a wide porch and a garden that looked straight up at the mountains. She was no longer just the retired teacher from far away. She had become a cornerstone of the mountain community, her laughter once again a familiar sound in the local market. Martha moved with a slight limp and carried a sturdy hawthorn cane, but her eyes held a clarity and peace that had been missing for years. She had traded her grief for a new kind of purpose, and the town loved her for it. Caleb Vance had undergone a transformation that was even more profound. The man who had once sought to disappear into the shadows of the Rockies was now the face of one of the most respected organizations in the state, the Silverthorne K9, Search and Rescue Center. No longer a hermit, Caleb had used the last of his military savings to renovate an old timber mill at the base of the mountain into a world-class training facility. He still carried the scars of war, and his tea-colored eyes still held the depth of a man who had seen too much, but the hollow stillness had been replaced by a quiet, driving focus. He wore his flannel shirts with the sleeves rolled up, his seal tattoo visible for all to see, no longer a mark of shame, but a symbol of the brothers he carried with him. Caleb had realized that his skills weren't meant to be buried in a cabin. They were meant to ensure that no mother ever had to wait in the dark for a son who wasn't coming home. Shadow, of course, was the soul of the operation. Now 6 years old, the German Shepherd had become a living legend across Colorado. His story, the K9 who rescued a hero's mother and led a broken soldier back to the light, had spread far beyond the valley. Shadow didn't seem to care for the fame. He remained the same stoic, amber-eyed guardian he had always been. He spent his days mentoring younger pups, teaching them how to read the wind and trust the bond with their handlers. But every evening, without fail, he would trot down the road to Martha's cottage, where a bowl of fresh water and a special spot on her porch awaited him. He had 2 homes now, and 2 lives to guard. During the grand opening of the center, a new face arrived in Silverthorne, Sheriff Elias Thorne. Elias was a man in his late 50s, with a weathered face that looked like it had been carved out of Sierra granite, and a silver mustache that sat sternly above a mouth that rarely smiled. He was a veteran of the state police, a man who valued results over rhetoric. Elias had come to officially designate Shadow as the first honorary K9 emeritus of the Colorado Search and Rescue Council. "We've seen a lot of dogs in these mountains, Vance," Elias said, his voice a gravelly baritone as he patted Shadow's broad head. "But this one, he's got a bit of something else in him. It's like he's working for a higher command." Caleb just nodded, looking at Shadow, knowing exactly what the sheriff meant. A year to the day after the blizzard, the air at Silverthorne was crisp and scented with the sweetness of new grass. Caleb, Martha, and Shadow met at the trailhead of the North Slope. It wasn't a day for training or patrols. It was a day for a promise. Martha wore a light hiking vest over a simple linen shirt, her hawthorn cane clicking steadily against the stones. Caleb carried a small pack, but his gait was light, his shoulders finally square and free of the invisible weight they had carried for so long. They climbed slowly, the mountain no longer feeling like a battlefield, but like an old friend. When they reached the limestone alcove at the Devil's Throat, the sun was high, casting a golden glow over the valley below. Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silk pouch she had carried a year ago. She looked at Caleb, her eyes damp but smiling. "It took us a while to get back here, didn't it?" she whispered. Caleb stepped beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "We're right on time, Martha." Together, they stood at the edge of the overlook. As Martha opened the pouch and let the ashes of Daniel Miller catch the mountain breeze, the gray dust swirled upward, dancing in the light, before vanishing into the vast, beautiful expanse of the Rockies. Caleb didn't feel the sting of the IED or the heat of the desert in that moment. He felt the warmth of the sun and the steady breathing of the dog at his feet. As they began the walk back down, Caleb looked at Shadow, who was trotting ahead, his notched ear twitching as he tracked a butterfly. Caleb finally understood the truth that had been hiding in the snow all along. Daniel hadn't truly left him alone in that desert. In his final moments, Daniel had entrusted Caleb with a mission that would take a year to reveal itself. He had sent Shadow to keep Caleb alive, and he had sent Martha to give Caleb a reason to live. The miracle of Silverthorne wasn't just surviving a storm. It was the realization that love is a tether that can reach across any distance, even the one between life and death. The soldier, the mother, and the dog walked toward the valley, leaving the ghosts behind and stepping into the brilliance of a new dawn. Sometimes the rescue we need does not come from a helicopter or a loud siren. Sometimes it comes quietly through the paws of a loyal dog, or the unexpected forgiveness of a stranger. This story reminds us that God can use our deepest wounds to bring us our greatest purpose. Caleb thought his life ended in the desert, and Martha thought hers ended when she lost her son. But God used a faithful dog named Shadow to lead them both out of the dark and back into the light.
In our own lives, we all have storms we are trying to survive. We all have unopened letters in our hearts, memories we are too afraid to face, or guilt we carry alone.
But remember this, no matter how deep the snow gets, you are never truly lost. There is always a way back. You just have to be willing to take that first step, to trust the instinct of love, and to let someone help you carry the weight. Be like Shadow in someone else's life. Be loyal, patient, and willing to sit with them in the cold until the morning comes. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might be weathering their own storm today. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. And if you want to walk more of these trails with us, please subscribe to the channel.
May God bless every person listening to my voice right now. May He heal your unseen scars, give you the courage to open your heart again, and send you a faithful friend when the night feels too cold. If you believe that God can turn our deepest pain into our greatest peace, type Amen in the comments below. Thank you for listening.